Out of the tree line, a woman on the edge. The Wyoming Territory in late October of 1879 had a way of testing a body's limits. That morning the wind came in sharp and sudden, slapping at the face and clawing through whatever meager warmth a person carried. Holly Sumner stumbled out from the shelter of the tree line like she had been spit out by the earth itself. Bare feet pressing into grass, stiff and brittle with frost. The cold cut into her skin as if every blade was a shard of glass, and by the time she reached the open slope, her soles were slick with blood. Her dress, what was left of it, hung crooked from one shoulder, the hem ripped and snagged. Dirt clung in patches along her sleeves, and collarbone dried blood crusted in a dark streak across her cheek. Tear tracks cut clean lines through the grime, but her eyes looked past exhaustion, past fear. They looked hollow. The land rolled downward toward a squat little ranch house, weathered and low against the wind. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from its chimney, carried off almost instantly into the pale sky. A horse stood tied to the hitching post, its head tucked against the gusts. Holly half stumbled, half slid down the slope, each step a battle between her weight and the icy bite of the ground beneath her. By the time she reached the edge of the yard, her breathing was ragged, coming in shallow bursts. On the porch sat a man. He hadn't moved since she first caught sight of him, elbows resting on his knees, a battered hat shadowing his eyes. There was no startle in him, no rush to his feet, just a stillness that made the distance between them feel heavier than it was. Holly tried to lift her chin, but her neck felt like it bore the weight of the miles she'd fled. Her voice came out raw, almost hoarse. "I'm dirty, poor, and barely alive." For a heartbeat he stayed where he was, studying her the way a man studies a storm on the horizon, calculating if it will pass or break over him. Then he rose, slow and deliberate boots sounding hollow on the porch boards. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough she could see the pale stubble along his jaw, the hard lines weather had carved into his face. His voice was quiet, steady in a way that didn't match the cutting wind. "So was I once." "Come inside." The world blurred around her. The weight in her legs gave way before she could answer. Darkness swept in like a tide, swallowing the cold and the ache all at once. Shelter and names. When Holly's eyes opened again, the light was dim and the air warm enough to make her lungs ache with relief. She was lying on a cot shoved against the wall, the rough wool of a blanket pulled up under her chin. The scent of wood smoke wrapped around her, threaded through with something faint and savory, beans maybe, or meat stew. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, only that her limbs felt heavy and her skin prickled as heat worked its way back into her bones. The man from the porch was there, kneeling by the open hearth. He stirred a blackened pot with the kind of care that comes from habit, not haste. When he turned his head slightly, the firelight caught the edge of his face, broad, unshaven, with the stony color of creek rock in his eyes. "You awake?" She managed a small nod, her throat tightening. He stood crossing the short space between them with an easy, deliberate stride. In his hand was a tin cup of water steam barely rising from its surface. When she tried to take it, her fingers shook so badly she nearly spilled it. Without comment, he shifted his grip, steadying her hands with his own until she could drink. The water slid down her throat like something she'd been missing for years. "Name's Coulter Prescott," he said once she set the cup down. Holly. She had to swallow before she could finish. Sumner. He gave a single nod, not prying, not asking anything more than she offered. Up close, she could see the patchwork on his shirt, neat stitches in worn cotton, and the calluses on his knuckles ground into him by years of work. He moved like someone who had built his life one hard day at a time. "How long you been out there?" he asked. "I don't know." "Days. Maybe more." He waited, his gaze steady but not pressing. "I was with a wagon train. South of here. We were headed toward Rollins. Got jumped bandits, I think." Her voice faltered, grief locking her jaw. "I ran. I kept running." He nodded again, the gesture carrying neither pity nor doubt, just a kind of recognition she couldn't name. Morning on the porch. An unasked question. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of cold that seeped into the wood grain of the porch and turned each breath into a pale ghost in the air. Holly sat on the edge of the steps, wrapped in an old wool coat that was far too large for her, but carried the lingering heat of its owner. Her feet were bandaged, the cloth wrapped snugly around each arch, and for the first time in days they weren't bleeding. Her hair, still damp, clung in loose strands against her neck, smelling faintly of lye soap. Coulter had been up for hours. She'd heard him moving about before dawn, boots on the floorboards, the low scrape of a chair, the creak of the barn door's hinges. Now he stepped out beside her, the air shifting slightly as the door closed behind him. In each hand he carried a mug, steam rising from the black liquid inside. Without a word, he handed her one. She took it, feeling the heat seep into her fingers. "Why did you take me in?" He lowered himself onto the step beside her, one elbow braced on his knee. "Because someone once did the same for me." That answer sat between them for a moment, heavier than the cold. She stared down into the dark swirl of the coffee, trying to remember the last time she'd been given something without a price. "I used to be a seamstress," she said, her voice quieter now, almost swallowed by the wind. "Back in Ohio. My brother had a farm. After he died, I had nothing, so I came west." He turned his head, studying her profile. "You married?" She shook her head quickly. "No, never." He took a sip from his mug and didn't press further. His silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that left room for the truth, but didn't demand it. She risked a glance at him and found him looking out toward the frost-silvered grass. His eyes steady, the kind of steady that made her wonder what storms he'd stood through to earn it. "I was once," he said finally. Her gaze flicked toward him. "What happened?" "She died." The words were simple, stripped of drama, and yet they carried a weight that pressed against the cold morning air. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The only sound was the slow whisper of the wind curling through the tall, dry grass beyond the fence line. Earning her keep. Over the next few days, Holly found her strength creeping back into her limbs. The ache in her ribs dulled, the bruises along her arms began to fade from deep purple to yellow. She could walk without the sharp stab in her feet, though she still moved carefully as if the ground might turn against her. She began to help where she could not, because Coulter asked, but because it felt wrong to take without giving something in return. The first morning she carried water from the pump, her hands numbing against the iron handle. He passed her without a word, just a faint lift of his brow. She mended a broken hinge on the chicken coop, hammering the bent nail flat, before securing it with a fresh one she found in the barn. When he came to check on the hens that evening, he paused at the sight, then simply moved on. The work was simple grounding in a way she hadn't felt in years. She washed dishes beside the pump, the cold water biting at her fingers, sunlight catching in the droplets. She folded laundry in the yard, the clean fabric warm from where it had hung all afternoon in the sun. One evening, he handed her a torn shirt as she stood near the small table. "That one's been waiting a year," he said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. She smiled faintly. "I can do better than that." She fixed it by lantern light, her head bent over the careful stitches, while he sat nearby, reading a folded newspaper. She felt his eyes drift toward her now and then, though he never said a word about it. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared space, as if the room itself had learned to breathe around two people instead of one. That night, she lay on the narrow cot he'd set up for her in the corner of the single-room cabin. The wind outside whispered against the eaves, and she listened to the soft creak of his boots across the floor as he moved about. She felt warmer than she had in weeks, the ache in her chest easing not from heat, but from the quiet certainty that for the moment she was safe, not a burden. The barn was warmer than the outside air, the smell of hay and horse sweat thick enough to soften the edge of the frost still clinging to the morning. Holly leaned against the open stall, watching the mare shift her weight and flick an ear. Her hands rested lightly on the rail, the wool coat collar pulled high against her neck. "You always live alone?" she asked, her voice quiet, but carrying in the stillness. Coulter straightened from where he'd been brushing the mare's flank, the long strokes of the brush steady and unhurried. "Not always," he said after a beat. "Just got used to it." She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the wood. "I don't want to be a burden." His hand stilled for only a moment before resuming. "You're not." The words were plain, but they landed with a weight that made her chest tighten. She wanted to believe him, but years of scraping by had taught her that kindness often came with an invisible hook. She searched his face for any hint of pity, but found none, just that same even steadiness, as if he'd already weighed her presence and found it worth the space. "I'm not sure where to go." She admitted the truth spilling out before she could pull it back. "When I left Ohio, I thought I'd find somewhere to start over, but I don't know where that is anymore. You don't have to go," he said, his voice low, almost matter-of-fact, as if it wasn't a decision made in that moment, but something he'd known since she stepped out of the trees. She took a slow step closer, the straw crunching softly beneath her boots. "I don't have anything to offer." He turned toward her, then the brush resting in his hand. "You're alive." "That's more than enough." Her cheeks flushed with the directness of it, but she didn't look away. For a long breath, they simply held each other's gaze, the dust motes drifting between them like slow-falling snow. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the word. He gave a short nod, almost like a man acknowledging a deal struck. "You're welcome to stay as long as you want." Outside, the wind rattled the barn door on its hinges, but in the small space between them, there was only stillness. First snow, first touch. The days slipped into a gentle rhythm after that, each one marked by small acts that settled Holly deeper into the land. She learned where the creek curved slow enough to skim stones across its surface, where rabbits nested in the brush and darted like quick shadows at the edge of the pasture. She baked bread in the small oven, the crust golden and split from the heat. She mended the seams of his shirts and even stitched a new curtain for the lone window, the fabric catching the pale morning light. He didn't hover over her work, but she felt his awareness like the steady warmth of a fire you don't have to sit right beside to feel. When the first snow fell, it came soft and heavy, muffling the edges of the world. Holly stood at the door, mug of coffee cupped in her hands, watching the white gather on the fence rails and the roof of the barn. Her breath fogged the glass. Coulter came up beside her. His coat unbuttoned the brim of his hat, damp with melting flakes. "You ever seen Wyoming in winter?" he asked. She gave a faint smile. "Only just survived autumn." His answering smile was quiet, but it warmed something inside her that had been cold for a long time. That night they sat by the fire, closer than usual, their chairs angled just enough that her foot brushed against his beneath the table. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "I never thought I'd care again." He turned his head toward her. "You do?" She met his gaze. "Yeah, I do." Slowly, she reached out her hand, hovering in the air for a moment before finding his. His fingers laced through hers without hesitation, the calluses rough but steady against her skin. Later, when she leaned her head against his shoulder, he wrapped his arm around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. The firelight danced across the floor, shadows curling in the corners, and outside the wind howled across the plains. Inside they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Small trusts. The morning air was so cold it made her teeth ache. Holly stepped into the barn, with both hands wrapped around a tin pail, careful not to spill the warm mash she'd mixed for the mare. The light filtered in through the high gaps in the boards, pale and thin, catching on the dust motes swirling in the air. The mare turned her head at the sound of her boots on the straw ears, flicking forward in greeting. "She trusts you quicker than she did me." Coulter's voice came from the next stall, low and calm, as if he'd been standing there a while. Holly smiled faintly, rubbing the mare's neck with long, deliberate strokes. "She knows I won't make her pull anything heavier than she needs to. Same deal I'd offer anyone." He leaned on the post between them, watching her hands move. "You treat everything like it's got a soul. If it can hurt, it does." The statement hung there quiet, but pointed until he stepped back to fetch the feed bucket. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed just a whisper of contact, but neither of them pulled away. "I've been thinking about the south fence line," he said, his tone shifting into the practical. "Couple posts rotted straight through. Snow'll drop it clean if we let it." "I can help," she said instantly. "You're not swinging a maul with those wrists. I can carry rails or brace the line while you dig. There's more than one way to mend a place." His eyes held hers for a beat, measuring the resolve there. "All right, then." They worked together until mid-afternoon, breath clouding the air in soft white plumes. The slope behind the barn was treacherous with patches of frozen earth, but she kept pace beside him, holding the rails steady while he drove the spade into the ground. When he paused to wipe his brow, she handed him the next post without being asked. The rhythm they found was wordless, shaped by the scrape of metal on earth and the solid thunk of wood settling into place. "You always this stubborn?" he asked as he drove the last post in. "You always this surprised when someone keeps pace?" His chuckle was low, almost unguarded. That night, the firelight glowed against the rough-hewn walls while she sat darning a wool sock she'd found in an old chest. He leaned back in his chair across from her, watching her hands move with the same quiet attentiveness he'd shown all day. There was comfort in the absence of talk, the kind where silence said more than words could. Plans for spring. The next morning, Holly woke to the faint hiss of the kettle warming on the stove. Her coat hung by the door, neatly mended at the shoulder where the seam had been torn. She ran her fingers over the stitches, noting the uneven spacing and the way the thread pulled slightly in one corner. It wasn't her work, it was his. "Wasn't right you wearing it with the seam torn," he said without turning from the stove when she stepped into the room. "Did this best I could." Her lips curved not quite into a smile, but enough to soften the edges of her face. "Good hands." He stirred the pot jaw working. "I was thinking when spring comes I'll need to ride into town. Resupply." "I could come," she said almost before the thought had finished forming. He glanced at her then. "If you wanted, I'd like that." He set 2 bowls on the table. "Well, they'll ask questions." "They'll look," he said, "but they'll stop once they see I'm not letting you go." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "You wouldn't?" "No," he said, simply. "I wouldn't." That evening, snow began to fall again, the flakes drifting thick and silent past the window. She stood just outside the barn, looking out over the dark hills. The sky washed in the pale light of dusk. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked when Coulter stepped out to join her. Once he said his coat open to the cold. "Now I've got reason to stay." Her eyes held his steadily. "So do I." This time he reached for her hand first. She let him take it, their fingers lacing together in the hush of the gathering dark. There were no declarations, no promises, just the solid, unshakable knowing of 2 people who had stopped running. The wind picked up around them, but it curled soft at their backs, like something settling into place. The quiet between them. The snow held for days, layering the land in a hush so complete that even the creek's usual chatter was muted. Holly's mornings took on a rhythm, rising before the light edged over the horizon, gathering kindling from the shed, coaxing the stove's embers back to life. Her limbs still carried the ache of healing, but her movements were no longer tentative. They had a quiet purpose now. On the 6th morning, the sky cleared fully, sunlight spilling gold across the frozen pasture. Coulter had gone early to check the traps along the creek. She was alone on the porch, mending a set of oilskin rain slickers stiff with age. The needle punched through with effort, her breath puffing small clouds into the cold. When he returned, his boots were dusted with snow, and he carried a small leather pouch tied shut at the top. "Found this tucked behind a rock out near Sand Bluff," he said, setting it on the table inside. "Wasn't mine." She opened it carefully, the leather soft and worn from long use. Inside were buttons, bone brass, and one carved from antler, and a thimble smoothed thin from years of work. She rolled the antler button between her fingers, tracing the tiny grooves. "Think someone lost it," he said, "or left it behind on purpose." She considered. "I had a sewing box once. It rattled like this when I walked." Her thumb brushed over the thimble. "I want to keep it." He gave a short nod, already setting about cleaning the hair he'd trapped. She filled the pot with water, their movements fitting into each other without the need for instruction. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full-shaped by presence rather than absence. Later, as the stew simmered, she pulled her stool close to where he sat sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. "I never asked what you did before," she said. "Before this place, he didn't look up." Drove cattle. Arizona, then up through Kansas, Took a bullet in the shoulder near Abilene. After that I drifted. Found this land through a man I met in Laramie. He'd lost interest in it. I hadn't yet. She folded her hands in her lap. Do you ever want to leave it behind? No, but I wouldn't mind someone else knowing it like I do. It takes time to learn a place, she said softly. You've already started. A garden and a table. The storm rolled in that night rain, coming in steady sheets that rattled against the windows and pooled in the yard. Holly stood by the glass, the lantern glow, casting her shadow long across the floor. Coulter sat nearby, the blade forgotten in his lap, his gaze drawn to the darkness beyond the pane. What happened to your shoulder? She asked after a while. He paused before answering. Cattle drive went bad. We were crossing land the locals didn't want us on. One of them put a rifle on me. Bullet passed through, but it laid me open, long enough to know I wasn't invincible. She faced him fully. Is that when you stopped riding? He said, a hint of something like defiance in his tone. I kept going, but that's when I stopped following someone else's trail. She crossed the room, sitting on the floor beside his chair, knees tucked close. What would you have been if not a cattleman, he considered it. Maybe a map maker. I like knowing what's ahead. And what's hiding in the folds? She asked, a faint smile on her lips. His gaze flicked to hers. Maybe. She leaned her head against the side of the chair, letting the rain's steady patter fill the space between words. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and clean after the long freeze. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the yard a patchwork of snow melt and mud. Coulter was already at work, splitting kindling under the lean-to. Sleeves rolled sweat, streaking the dust on his arms. Holly stepped up beside him. You ever think about building on? She asked. He set the axe aside. What you have in mind, a second room, maybe a loft. His brow rose. Planning ahead. She crossed her arms. I was thinking of a garden and a table that doesn't wobble when someone leans on it. He studied her for a long moment before saying, Sounds like you're staying. I am, she said simply. That evening he brought her a folded sheet of paper, rough pencil lines of the cabin with the second room shaded in. I'm no draftsman, but I thought we could start here. She ran her fingers over the lines. You left space for a porch. Thought you might want one. You are right, she said. They stood close in the lamplight, the wind quiet for once. Between them, something felt already built, framing the future. The hammering began before the frost had lifted from the grass, a steady rhythm that echoed through the quiet trees beyond the ridge. Holly stood at the edge of the new timber frame, measuring each plank length by eye, while Coulter drove pegs into the joists. The sawdust clung to the hem of her skirt, a faint scent of fresh-cut pine rising in the cool morning air. She held the next board against the wall, bracing it with her shoulder while he climbed the ladder. You think it'll hold? She asked. It'll hold, he said, sliding the peg into place. You square it better than I ever did. She stepped back, brushing her palms together. Can't sew rafters, but I can line up a corner. His grin was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but it reached his voice. Makes me think you were meant to be out here. I wasn't meant for anything, she said, stooping to pick up another beam. But I'm learning what suits me. The walls of the new room took shape slowly, each board bought with sweat and patience. Holly had taken to marking tiny notches on the inside joists, one for each day they worked side by side. She never told him about the marks. They weren't for counting time. They were for keeping it like threads in a quilt, only she knew how to read. By early summer, the grass in the far pasture rose to their waists, and the wild flowers pressed across the lower field in waves of color. Coulter worked on splitting cedar planks for the porch rail, his shirt clinging to his back with the heat. Holly stood barefoot in the doorway of the new room, wiping sweat from her brow, watching him. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked. He let his hat fall back on its cord, resting against his shoulders. "I do now." "You haven't asked," she said. "I didn't want to press you. I wouldn't be standing here if I had." She stepped down from the porch, her boots in hand. "Would you say yes if you were asking?" He set down the draw knife, wiping his palms against his trousers. "Would you?" The air between them held still, like the breath before a hammer strike. "I've got no preacher, no ring, and no fine words," he said finally. "You've got me," she replied. "That's enough." A creekside wedding. 3 days later, they married beside the creek where the cottonwoods leaned over the water. Mrs. Elkins, the widow from 4 homesteads west, came to witness her son standing beside her with a small pine cross he had carved and fastened into the soil with a stone. The preacher rode up from Medicine Bow, his voice carrying over the murmur of the current. Holly wore the blue calico dress she'd stitched herself over the winter, its hem brushing the tops of her boots. Coulter wore the patched shirt she had mended that first week, the one with the neat stitches at the shoulder where she'd learned the shape of him without ever touching. The preacher's words were simple, and neither of them needed more than that. When Coulter took her hand, the calluses were familiar, his grip steady. They shared bread and dried apples beneath the cottonwoods, the sun warming their backs. When the ceremony ended, no one rushed away. The widow lingered, speaking quietly to Holly about planting onions early. Her son skipped stones across the creek. Coulter stood with her at the edge of the water, their shoulders brushing. "You regret it yet?" he asked, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She shook her head, the sunlight catching in her hair. "Not in this lifetime." They walked back toward the cabin together, their joined hands swinging slightly. Neither of them let go for the rest of the day. That night they sat on the porch beneath a sweep of stars, the boards of the new room behind them smelling of fresh cedar. The air was warm, the wind soft, and for the first time in years, Holly didn't feel like she was waiting for something to be taken away. Seasons turning. The seasons rolled forward with the surety of the sun's rise. By late summer, the porch stood finished, the cedar rails smoothing beneath their palms each time they leaned there to watch the pasture. Holly filled the space with small touches, a row of clay pots she'd shaped from creek bed clay. Drying bundles of sage and mint strung from the beams a wooden bench Coulter had carved for her with his draw knife. The scent of cedar mingled with the sharp greenness of her herbs, making the porch smell like something alive. In the garden, neat rows of beans, onions, and turnips stretched beside the shed. Holly knelt among them in the mornings, her skirts brushing the dirt as she plucked weeds and loosened the soil around the seedlings. She took quiet pride in each green shoot, pushing up toward the sun, a small act of defiance against the years she'd spent moving too often to put down roots. When Coulter rode into town for supplies, she went with him now. They'd buy coffee flour, a coil of rope, and whatever spare parts he needed for mending harness or fence. Sometimes they'd stop at the mercantile's counter for a cup of coffee, sitting side by side in the hush of the early afternoon. People looked Of course they did, but their curiosity dulled quickly when they saw the way Coulter's hand would rest on the counter, close enough to brush hers, or how he kept his gaze on her when she spoke. One morning, she found him standing at the far edge of the property, eyes fixed on the hills where the grass met the sky. The light was just beginning to spill over the ridge, turning the world gold. "You think we'll stay?" she asked. His answer was slow but certain. "There's nothing past that rise I need anymore." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "I never thought I'd belong to a place again." "It's not the place," he said. "It's who's in it." That night they sat on the porch with coffee and tin mugs, the stars unfurling wide above them. The sound of the wind through the grass was low and steady, like the land breathing. Contentment. They didn't speak for a while, just listened to the soft creak of the porch boards under their boots and the faint whistle of night insects in the grass. Coulter tilted his head toward her, the lamplight from the cabin catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. "I keep thinking about what we've built," he said finally. "This house, this life?" she asked. He nodded. "Every board, every morning." She set her mug down and looked at him directly the way she did when she wanted her words to leave no doubt. "It's ours." "You happy?" Her answer came without hesitation. "I am. I didn't know I could be, but I am." His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he leaned down, kissing her slow and sure. She rested her hand against his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heartbeat beneath her palm. That rhythm felt like the truest thing in her life, more certain than the seasons or the rise of the sun. They stayed like that long after the fire in the cabin burned down the night, folding around them like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's call carried across the pasture, and the sound didn't stir unease in her the way it might have once. Here she wasn't prey, she was home. Years would pass the cabin, weathering under sun and snow, but that night would stay fixed in her memory. The cedar-scented air, the warm press of his palm against hers, and the knowledge that she had found in him not just shelter from the dark, but the steady ground on which she could stand. The thaw. The thaw came slow, inching its way into the frozen ground in thin, glittering rivulets. Snowpack along the pasture edges shrank day by day, retreating in uneven lines, leaving behind dark, damp soil that clung to boots and wagon wheels. The air carried the scent of pine bark, warmed by sun, and the faint sweetness of wet earth. Holly sat on the flat stone near the well, mending the worn strap of a saddlebag. Her fingers moved with steady precision, the needle dipping in and out of the leather in a rhythm she'd learned to keep even no matter what thoughts drifted through her mind. Her cheeks had taken to color again, not from cold now, but from sun, and a few strands of hair escaped the braid over her shoulder, lifting in the breeze. Coulter came up from the creek trail leading a pack mule heavy with split firewood. He didn't call out, just let the quiet settle between them until he dropped the lead rope and crouched beside the tool bench. "New saddlebag?" he asked, unscrewing the cap of a tin of polish. "Yours," she said. The stitching was tearing near the buckle. "Figured it would split clean through if you rode out again." He glanced over eyes, catching on the neat, even lines she had already completed. "You always notice what's fraying." "It's habit," she said, tying off the thread. "You learn to look ahead if you don't want things falling apart in your hands." For a while, they worked in companionable silence, her finishing the saddlebag, him tending to the scuffed leather of his boots. The thaw might be slow, but in the air was a quiet urgency, the pull of spring work waiting just beyond the last patch of frost. When she stood and stretched, He straightened as well. "Found something in the east field," he said. "Could use another set of eyes." She followed him past the barn down the gentle slope where the ground was soft underfoot. The snow had melted in uneven patches here, revealing tufts of brown grass and matted leaves pressed into the earth. The east field. Near the edge of the property, half buried under moss and wind-blown pine needles, lay a rotted length of timber. Rusted nails jutted from it, bent sideways at the base. Coulter crouched and brushed away more of the debris with his gloved hand. "You think someone fenced this land before you?" she asked, squatting down beside him. "Could have been a miner or someone passing through." His voice was even though his gaze lingered on the timber longer than necessary. She reached into the dirt near its base, her fingers coming up blackened with charcoal. "There's burn here." She rubbed it between her fingertips. Someone burned something, maybe a brush pile, maybe something else. "Does it matter?" he asked, though there was no sharpness in his tone. She looked up at him, the wind lifting a loose strand of hair across her face. "No, but it reminds me this place wasn't always ours." He straightened eyes, moving past her toward the horizon where the hills met the pale spring sky. "It is now." She stood and placed a hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the worn flannel. For a moment, they simply stood there, the damp earth under their boots and the faint drip of melting snow from the pines around them. That night, rain came in steady sheets, tapping against the windows in an even rhythm. Holly stood at the window, watching the drops catch the lantern, light turn to gold and slide down the glass. Coulter sat nearby, the familiar rasp of his knife against the sharpening stone filling the space. "What happened to your shoulder?" she asked after a while, her gaze still on the dark outside. He paused, the blade resting still in his hand. "Cattle drive went bad. We were crossing land the locals didn't want us on. One of them put a rifle on me. Bullet passed through, but it laid me open." She turned toward him. "Is that when you stopped riding?" "I kept going, but that's when I stopped following someone else's trail." Her lips curved faintly. "Guess you've been on your own trail ever since." His eyes met hers, and there was something in them, not pride exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement. "Guess I have." "Here's the expanded points, 19 and 20, each 450, 600 words, moving from their quiet conversation in the rain into concrete plans for their shared future. Rain and dreams." The rain had deepened into a steady drumbeat against the roof, a rhythm that filled every corner of the cabin. The lantern on the table cast a soft glow over the rough-hewn walls, turning the small space into something cocoon-like. Holly leaned her shoulder against the window frame, watching the water stream down the glass in crooked paths. Behind her, Coulter worked the knife along the sharpening stone, the rasp and hiss of steel blending with the rain song. "What would you have been if not a cattleman?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the steady sounds. He didn't answer right away. The knife paused mid-stroke, his thumb running lightly along the edge to test its bite. "Maybe a map maker," he said at last. "I like knowing what's ahead." Her lips tilted in a small smile. "And what's hiding in the folds?" He looked up, his eyes catching hers in the lamplight. Maybe he allowed a ghost of humor in his voice. She came away from the window, crossing the room to sit on the floor beside his chair. The warmth from the fire pooled there soft against her knees. "When I was younger, I used to draw on the backs of bread paper," she said. "Dresses I'd never make." Houses I'd never live in. You're living in one now, he said, setting the knife aside. I know. That's the strange part. The rain softened, slipping into a gentler patter. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and far away, as if the storm was already moving on. Neither of them spoke for a while. The cabin felt like it was breathing with them, the air warmer for their shared quiet. Planning ahead. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air sharp with the scent of wet grass and pine resin. The yard was a patchwork of snowmelt and mud, the kind that clung to boots and splattered hems. Coulter was already outside under the lean-to, splitting kindling with the axe, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. Holly emerged from the cabin carrying a basket of eggs from the hen house, the shells still warm in her hands. "You ever think about building on?" she asked, leaning against the post of the lean-to. He swung the axe down, splitting the log clean. "What you have in mind? A second room, maybe a loft?" She shifted the basket in her arms. Planning ahead, he teased, glancing at her. "I was thinking of a garden," she said, her tone serious now, "and a table that doesn't wobble when someone leans on it." He set the axe aside, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist. "Sounds like you're staying." "I am." Something passed across his face then. Not surprise, not even relief, but a steadying, as if her words had locked something into place inside him. He didn't touch her, not yet, but she felt the shift as clearly as if the ground beneath them had settled. That evening he brought her a folded square of paper. She unfolded it to see a rough pencil sketch of the cabin with a shaded addition off one side. "I'm no draftsman," he said, "but I thought we could start here." Her gaze moved to the shaded rectangle, then back to him. "You left space for a porch. Thought you might want one." She looked at the sketch again, her fingers tracing the faint lines. "You were right," she said softly. They stood close in the lamplight, neither speaking. Outside, the wind had gone still, leaving only the soft crackle of the fire inside a fire that, like the life they were building, burned slow and steady, meant to last. Raising the frame. Building together. The frost still clung to the grass in silver threads when the first hammer blows echoed across the ridge. Holly stood with her back to the low morning sun, holding a plank steady against the new frame while Coulter drove pegs into place. Each strike rang out sharp in the cold air, the sound rolling down toward the creek like a steady drumbeat. Her palms were raw from carrying timber, but she didn't mind. The work was honest and immediate, her weight against the plank, his measured strength driving the wood into place. She lined up corners with an instinct she'd honed in years of sewing seams, straight squaring the frame with the same care she once gave to setting a hymn. "You've got a better eye for square than I ever did," he said from the ladder, sliding the peg home. She stepped back, brushing sawdust from her skirt. "Can't stitch a rafter, but I can make sure it won't list in the wind." The brim of his hat shadowed his grin, but she could hear it in his voice. "Makes me think you were meant to be out here." "I wasn't meant for anything," she said, stooping to lift the next board. "But I'm learning what suits me." By midday, the walls had begun to take shape, not just as lines in the dirt, but as something that could hold a life inside. Holly had taken to marking tiny notches on the inside joists with the tip of her knife, one for each day they worked side by side. She didn't tell him about the marks. They weren't to count time. They were to keep it. The air warmed as the sun climbed higher, melting the frost, so their boots pressed deep into the damp ground. When the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and thawed earth, she caught Coulter watching her from the corner of his eye. Not in the way men looked at a woman they wanted, but in the way someone watches a partner match their pace and knows they can be counted on. The porch and the question. By early summer, the porch rail stood finished, its cedar slats still pale and smelling sharp under the sun. Coulter was working the draw knife along a final post when Holly stepped into the doorway, wiping sweat from her brow. The new room's floorboards were warm under her bare feet, and beyond the porch, the pasture shimmered in the heat. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked, her voice carrying easily over the soft scrape of wood. He paused mid-stroke, letting the blade rest against the rail. "I do now. You haven't asked." His gaze flicked to hers, steady and measuring. "I didn't want to press you. I wouldn't be standing here if I had." She stepped down into the yard, her boots in hand. "Would you say yes if you were asking?" The heat between them shifted, then not sharp like the summer sun, but slow and certain, like water wearing a path through stone. "I've got no preacher, no ring, and no fine words," he said finally, his voice low. "You've got me," she answered without hesitation. "That's enough." The air between them seemed to still, and for a long moment they simply stood there, two people who had walked far from where they began, now finding themselves on the same piece of ground. 3 days later they would stand beside the creek and say the words aloud. But in that moment, under the cedar scent of the porch and the gold weight of summer light, the choice was already made. "All right, here's the expanded points, 23 and 24 each. 450, 600 words, giving you the full creekside wedding scene and the seasons of shared work and quiet after." The creekside wedding. The creek ran high that morning, snowmelt from the far mountains tumbling over smooth stones with a sound that filled the air like soft applause. Cottonwoods lined the bank, their leaves a tender green against the pale sky. Holly stood on the east side, the blue calico dress she'd stitched herself swaying just above her boots. She had braided her hair back simply without ribbon or lace, and the wind tugged a few strands loose to frame her face. Coulter waited opposite her, wearing the shirt she'd mended that first week, a patch at the shoulder neat enough to be invisible if you didn't know it was there. His hat was off, tucked under his arm, and the sun caught in the light stubble along his jaw. Mrs. Elkins, the widow from 4 homesteads west, stood to one side holding a small pine cross her son had carved. The boy had driven it into the earth with a smooth river stone marking the spot where they stood. The preacher from Medicine Bow had ridden out at dawn, his voice carrying easily over the creek's rush. The vows were short. Neither Coulter nor Holly needed flourishes, just the quiet certainty of the words and the weight of each other's gaze. When the preacher asked, "Do you take?" the answers came low and steady without hesitation. Coulter's hand closed over hers, calloused and warm, his thumb resting against the pulse in her wrist. Afterward, they shared bread and dried apples beneath the shade of the cottonwoods. Mrs. Elkins spoke softly with Holly about planting onions before the soil turned too warm, and the boy skipped stones until the preacher mounted his horse for the ride home. When the last of the company left Coulter and Holly lingered by the water. "Regret it," yet he asked, the corner of his mouth twitching. She met his eyes and shook her head. "Not in this lifetime." They walked back to the cabin together, hand in hand. That night, they sat on the porch beneath a wide sweep of stars, the new room behind them still smelling of fresh cedar. For the first time in years, Holly went to sleep without the faint ache of waiting for something to be taken away. Seasons of work and quiet. The days after the wedding unfolded without fanfare, just the work of keeping the place running, mending fence where the snow had dropped it, turning soil for the garden, tending the mare and mule. Holly moved easily through the routines, now her hands as comfortable at the pump or the woodpile as they were with a needle and thread. The porch filled with her touches, bundles of drying sage and mint hanging from the rafters. Clay pots lined along the rail the bench Coulter had carved for her, pushed into the patch of afternoon sun. In the garden, neat rows of beans, onions, and turnips pushed green shoots through the dark soil, their leaves trembling in the breeze. They rode into town together for supplies, now their errands practiced and quiet. Sometimes they lingered over coffee at the Mercantile. Their conversation low the rhythm between them, as steady as the ticking of the clock on the wall. Folks looked when they came in, but the looking had changed, less curiosity now, more a kind of nodding acknowledgement. One warm evening they sat on the porch watching the light fade across the pasture. Coulter's hand rested on the rail beside hers, their fingers just close enough to touch. "You think we'll stay here?" she asked. "There's nothing past that rise I need anymore," he said without looking away from the horizon. She smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd belong to a place again." "It's not the place," he said. "It's who's in it." When the first frost of autumn brushed the fields, they worked side by side to cover the garden beds, laughter threading through the chill air as they raced the fading light. At night, they sat close to the fire, reading aloud or mending gear. The silences were never empty. Now they were full-layered with the presence of two people who had stopped running and learned the shape of each other's days.